sitting right off the docks. So there's no, we couldn't control things. They were totally in control. Now, Ambassador Horton observed, who were these men? He says, quote, peaceful farmers of Asia Minor and the citizens of Smyrna, who were never in sympathy with the government of Constantine, and who are in no way responsible for the fearful fate which has befallen them. This unrighteous act is being carried out without even a word of protest by any civilized government. And unfortunately, that seems to be continuing to be the case. Now, his underscores a couple of points. First is, these are not soldiers. These are not soldiers retreating from the field of battle. These are just ordinary people that are caught in the docks. He further points out they're not even monarchists. I mean, not that a monarchist is bad, but they weren't particularly supporters of the attack to the interior. You can tell that from voting patterns and so forth. So, why were they detained? Well, there's 2 or 3 reasons why he could have been detained. One reason was that Ataturk could have feared that in the future these people were going to gather in Greece and come back and try to take back their city. Not that likely, but you know, we had the Bay of Pigs with the Cubans, let's say, so they had that fear, which might be somewhat legitimate. They needed prisoners to exchange if there was going to be an exchange of prisoners with the Greek army, which had a lot of Turkish prisoners. But I think that what really was going on is they were stripping families of their males. Okay, they were sending them penniless to Greece. Those families would be a tremendous burden on Greece for the next 10 to 20 years. Without males, without money, some of them not speaking Greek that well because they spoke dialects and what have you. So I think part of this was a planned destruction of the Greek community. Now, early in October, most of these men who had not already died in detention camps, may have died in detention camps, began to be marched into the interior. And at least one column I read of 5,000, they said only about 500 reached the final destination. And when it came time for the final exchange of prisoners, which was finally made, only about 100 people were able to make the exchange. That's one column. And I think that's pretty typical. What would happen after the Treaty of Lausanne, the Greek and Turkish governments decided to exchange all prisoners, and so some men were able to be released then. But tens of thousands of Greek and Armenian men were killed in Smyrna in October by the Turkish government. And again, I just want to emphasize this, under the command of Ataturk, not some irregular, not some crazy guy in the mountains. Now, the subsequent history of the Turks has followed the course that they set in 1922, and even earlier with the genocidal attacks about the Pontians, the Assyrians, and the Armenians. There were 2 major assaults on the Greek population engineered by the Turkish government in the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1974, the Turks occupied half of Cyprus and drove out all the Christians from their zone. In Turkey, there are numerous laws aimed against non-Muslim citizens, dealing with taxation, dealing with military service, etc. And the Greek Orthodox Church has been under constant assault in Turkey. And I would say that within the last 10 years, it got worse. It got worse. It's got to the point now where it is very, not likely, but many people have said the patriarch now sitting in Constantinople may be the last one to sit in Constantinople. So this continual harassment of Christians has been quite effective. In the Treaty of Lausanne, I think I skipped past that. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, the Turks and the Greeks decided to exchange the last of their population. And somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million Greeks were expelled from Asia Minor, and about 500,000 Turks were expelled from Greece. So it's ethnic cleansing on both sides. Venizelos was not the prime minister, but he negotiated the treaty, and he basically said, a lot of this exchange has already been done, let's just formalize it, because anybody who's left behind is going to be killed. The only people left behind were 270,000 Greeks in Constantinople. And the Turks wanted them to stay, because they were running most of the city. And if they lost the Greek population in Constantinople, the city would probably collapse. So they insisted that the Greeks stay. And there were about 130,000 Turks were allowed to remain in Greece, in Thrace. And what's interesting is what's happened to those two populations. In 1923, in Constantinople, there were 270,000 Greeks. In 1911, there are 1,742 as of last month, and most of them are aged. In Thrace, where there was 130 Turks, there are still a goodly number of Turks, about the same number, and they elect members to the Greek parliament, and they do have some local government offices. Now, we can't and should not hold the present Turkish population responsible for actions that their grandparents or parents did, or even more recent actions. We can, however, hold the Turkish government responsible for its deceitful accounts of these events in its educational textbooks it creates for its schools and its universities. Worst of all, we can hold the Turkish government responsible for its attack on Turks who want to tell the truth. Many Turkish intellectuals, as a group, are not a bad group. They want to get this page cleaned, and the Turkish government doesn't allow them to do it. A Nobel laureate, my goodness, one of the highest prizes in the world, was threatened with jail for what he wrote about the Armenian massacres. Others have been jailed, and a few have actually been murdered. So we can hold the Turkish government responsible for that. And I think we have to hold the Turkish government responsible for its continual denial in every international forum of the Pontian genocide, the expulsion of the Assyrians, the Smyrna catastrophe, the Armenian genocide. They just deny it. They come with these excuses as irregulars and what have you. And I would say this, Turkey would do well to follow the example of the United States. Generally speaking, to be practical and honest, every nation does things it shouldn't do when it's being formed. The United States was no exception. The United States had a quasi-genocide against Native Americans. What strikes me also with the Native American quasi-genocide, I say quasi because it didn't quite get rid of everybody, is they had death marches. I don't know many people know that, but in many Native American tribes that were located in North Carolina, Georgia, so were forced to walk to Oklahoma. And by the time they reached Oklahoma, most of them were dead and gone. Once they got to Oklahoma, they couldn't speak their own languages. In many cases, they weren't allowed to dress in native garbs. Well, this is not pleasant, but the United States has admitted this. If you get a textbook from an elementary school, they will talk about that. If you go to a university class, they'll talk about it. So this doesn't excuse the past, and it may not make all the descendants feel that wonderful, but it allows you to go forward. It allows you to go forward. And what do we see? We see that Native Americans have been governors, they've been senators, and the many small towns and so forth are run by Native Americans. If we talk about African Americans, an even bigger problem, which is continuous, all things said and done, there is a black seat on the Supreme Court. 80% of all the generals in the American Army, 8% are black. And yes, a black man whose father was not a Christian sits in the White House. Well, can you imagine a Greek, an Armenian, or an Assyrian holding comparable positions in Turkey? No, because they cannot go forward culturally because they continue to lie. In fact, I've yet to uncover an instance where any Armenian, any Jew, any Assyrian, or any Greek has been elected to office in the history of the Turkish Republic. If there is one, I'd like to have somebody let me know about it. Now, how do we talk with these things? When addressing the American public about these realities, I think we always have to speak as Americans and avoid the trap of being seen as kind of ethnocentric Greeks emotionally settling a grudge. We want to avoid that. In fact, I believe that the Turks would like us that way. They would like to have this emotional, I am a Greek and I'm here to tell you such and such. That's exactly the wrong tactic to take. And you have to realize how, I use the word ignorant, most of the American public is about these events. Ignorant without knowledge. There's recently a fairly good spy book by Alan First, who had a very pro-Greek character, and they're talking about the Turks. He says, well, you know, we've been fighting the Turks since Troy. No, we haven't. There are no Turks at Troy. You know, the Turks didn't arrive until the 11th or 12th century in Asia Minor. But see, this writer who's pro-Greek, I mean, this character is pro-Greek, doesn't know that. He's ignorant. The publisher who read the manuscript doesn't know that. The reviewers who review the book don't know that. So we have to avoid being thought of as these crazy Greeks that are always fighting with the Turks since the beginning of time. What we have to do is talk about the religious and ethnic intolerance that is characteristic, has remained characteristic of Turkey. Americans may not care about Greeks. They don't know what a Pontian is. They probably think an Assyrian is some kind of mistake. But all of them are concerned about Christianity in a Muslim nation. All of them are concerned about how Christians are treated in Muslim nations. So two characteristics of the American system is the equality of all all citizens before the law, and separation of church and state with toleration of all faiths. That's what we have to talk about. Now, Elizabeth Perdomo of Boston University, who's the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, last week said the following about the Turkish government. Turkey is a highly sophisticated, authoritarian state, speaking the language of democracy, but not behaving like a democracy. And that's the point we have to ram home. Now, what do we want from Turkey? After all, they're the main players, aren't they? Formal apologies never mean much to me. I think it's not very, Greeks don't care about apologies too much. What I want to see them is do something. And I think that if they don't do something, they don't make certain reforms, then any apology they might make, which they're not going to make anyhow, is meaningless. What do we want them to do, and what must they do? They must cease their denial of the past. They must cease this in various international forums, and they have to stop misinforming their own people, miseducating their own people, and attacking their own intellectuals. Reform means that they're going to have to stop the persecution of the Orthodox Church and other Christian entities in Turkey. If they don't do that, Turkey can never achieve the status in the world that it wants. If they don't do that, Turkey cannot be a dependable ally of the United States. And if Turks do not do that, Greece and Turkey can never have an honorable reconciliation.